Let's configure IP services in MikroTik. In this video, configure IP services in MikroTik. We will check what are the default services that our MikroTik device is listening to. From there, we will try to test access for each service. So we have some sample third-party application that we will use to demonstrate to test access. Then we will go through how others or non-admins can know what are the ports that our MikroTik is using. So even if we change them, they might use some software to know these ports. We will try to demonstrate on how we can prevent these scanners. Also, we will discuss the reality of attempts of unauthorized access. In fact, we will have a demo about these attacks. Finally, we will discuss some steps on how we can prevent them to safeguard our MikroTik and our network. And one important note, so this video tutorial is for educational purposes only, and whatever demonstration or examples that you could see are plainly for learning purposes only. Okay, so we are inside or we are connected to our MikroTik. So in order for us to determine what are the default services that are opened or this MikroTik is listening into, we could go to IP menu and services. So there are 8 services that are default listed here, but only 7 is open. Okay, so we have the API SSL, FTP, SSH, Telnet, Winbox, www, and www-SSL. Okay, so API or Application Programming Interface is on port number 8728. So it does not indicate whether it's TCP or UDP. So we could run some applications later. Or if we take a look at the documentation of MikroTik, so we will also find out what are these ports, whether they are TCP or UDP. Or fundamentally, there are ports that are well known, for example, FTP, SSH, Telnet, and www. So fundamentally, we know what are these ports are. So for API, it's 8728, and API secured or SSL is 8729. So if our MikroTik has a default listening port for API, so meaning to say our MikroTik allows other products or other services, not MikroTik, to communicate to, for example, this router OS and perform some functions, okay, say for example, monitoring the hotspot, creating some rules here, so they communicate so that other product communicates to this MikroTik router OS via these ports. So in a while, I will show you one example of that particular product. So as an example of a service or product that communicates to our MikroTik via this API port 8728, so we have the popular program or application, the userman. Okay, so if you run this, the userman, so you'll notice that you'll type the IP address, obviously the IP address of your MikroTik or anything that is reachable from this computer to this MikroTik, because you could have several IP addresses on your MikroTik. But what is important here, it is on 8728. So this particular application, the userman, communicates via this software or its software to our MikroTik via 8728. Okay, so the userman, just a quick background. So if you don't have any user management package, so if you take a look at system users and if you go through your package list, so and if your device or your model or specific model does not support the installation of user management or user manager, which is the Radius server application of MikroTik. So you could use this third-party software, for example, the userman, to act as the user manager instead. Okay, so it communicates on 8728. Let us just have a quick try or quick login or quick use of the userman. So we will type in the IP address of our MikroTik. So again, as a review, IP addresses 192.168.88.1. Our login is admin, and as a default, there's no password. Okay, so if the IP address and user login and password is correct, then we click the login button. So now we have successfully launched, and meaning to say this userman successfully connected to our MikroTik. So if you would ask for download or application info, so feel free to visit the developer website for download and support. Our MikroTik is also listening on port 21 for file transfer protocol. So basically our MikroTik acts as a FTP server wherein a third-party application will try to access or communicate via port 21 and access what's inside our file system. Okay, so we have a file system or a file repository or directory, if you may, in our MikroTik, wherein we could put in our scripts or our backup config in order for future restore, or if we are running a hotspot service, so it will also list the directories on our hotspot templates so that we could either backup or update the hotspot pages or templates. So again, we could use FTP port 21 and we could use a third-party software to access our files in our MikroTik. Okay, so currently our files folder or directory don't have any contents aside from the skins directory. So for example, we try to run a backup command or export command. So export file, for example, sample.rsc. So once I issue this command and it will form the export, it will be saved to this file list. Also, you have a system resources to show your hard disk space or your space. So it varies, depends on the model. Okay, so if I hit enter, and when it is done, you notice that we now have the sample.rsc file here in our files or file list directory. So now we could either log in to our MikroTik and download this one, or we could use our FileZilla client, an example of a FTP client. So it's freely downloadable. Okay, you just visit to the corresponding website, and from here you'll just type the IP address of your MikroTik, the username, and the password. And if in case the port is changed, then you will also indicate So for us, it's all default. So connect. And there you go. You see now on your right side or the remote side, you'll see the sample RSC. So from here, you could download and save it to your local PC. So for instance, I will put it on my documents just for example, and I will download it. And there you go. The transfer of the file is finished. Next on our list or IP service list are SSH and Telnet. So these two are practically the same in their main objective, which is to provide some sort of virtual terminal connection from a remote device or even within the local network to our MikroTik or to any device for that matter. So what I mean by a virtual terminal connection, because if you are in your MikroTik, so you could go into new terminal, so meaning to say you are now at the command line interface for this MikroTik. So this is what the SSH and Telnet will try to achieve, but they are on a remote computer instead of us accessing directly from a MikroTik device the new terminal. So we could use this application or this software, Putty or Putty. So if you want to download, so feel free to visit these sites. So what you can do here is type in the IP address or the host name if there is. So IP address of our MikroTik 192.168.88.1. So on port 23 for Telnet, and for SSH is by default port number 22. So let's test first the Telnet. So click open and you will type in the login. The password is blank, and there you go. You are now inside your MikroTik, and from here you could issue some MikroTik commands to either monitor or manage and further configure this MikroTik. This time, let's try SSH or the Secure Shell Protocol. So just the same, you'll type in the MikroTik's IP address and the port number. By default for SSH is port number 22. So we click open. So we have some alert or information for us. Okay, so we just click accept. So log in as admin, and there's no password, so we can access. So if we try to issue the same command, so IP address print, and we could also add addresses. Okay, it's not only by viewing. So for example, add addresses 192.168.1.1/24 on interface ether4 disabled no, and we hit enter. And if we do an IP address print again, so therefore we now have two IP addresses. So for the information of others that don't know yet, so between the two, Telnet and SSH, so there is obviously preference of SSH than Telnet because Telnet is unsecured and SSH is, of course, by its name, is secured. So between these two, we prefer to disable the Telnet and leave the SSH enabled. Next is Winbox or MikroTik's protocol, Winbox 8291. So I'm currently logged in via Mac Winbox, not IP Winbox. So what I'm trying to say is if I connect again to the same MikroTik, but this time I won't select the MAC address, but I'll select the IP address. So basically, I'm telling the MikroTik Winbox to connect to the IP on the port number 8291. So the Winbox utility or software talks to the MikroTik router OS or our MikroTik device via port number 8291. So if we click connect, so basically, so on this left side, we are connected via MAC. Here, we are connected via IP address. Next is triple W on port 80 and triple W dash SSL or HTTPS on port number 443. So this is by default disabled. So we could use our known browsers, Mozilla, Google Chrome, and other browsers to administer our MikroTik. So for instance, we could use our Google Chrome, so 192.168 and 88.1, and we are now inside the web fig. So this is now the browser equivalent of that Winbox. So basically, if you take a look at what is inside, it's the same. Capsman, you still have Capsman here, wireless. Okay, so you have this one is wireless here. We have interfaces. The quickset is right here, and the rest of the menus you can also see it on our Winbox. Okay, so what if we enable our triple W dash SSL on port 443 so that our MikroTik is also listening on this port? So we click on this service and click on the enable or check. So 443, and let's try on our Chrome HTTPS. So 192.168.88.1, and this site can provide a secure connection. Let's try on our Mozilla Firefox, and it's also the same. Secure connection failed, and we cannot establish a communication or a secure communication on this particular IP address. We can solve this by having a self-signed certificate, or if you have the budget, a public certificate. So we can go to system certificates. So I already have some certificates for my server and for my client. So my server will be also this MikroTik, and my client will be this particular operating system or this particular computer. So I could edit the certificate as the server certificate, click apply, click OK. Then I exported the client certificate, so this one. So I export it and store it on my personal certificate store, for example, in Windows operating system. So if you'll notice, inside my personal certificate, I have the client one. So this certificate. So this time, once we have that in place, so if in our IP services, we now have the certificate here. So let's try to relaunch. And there you go. You can now successfully open the MikroTik device webfig via HTTPS. Now, so since these ports or these services is a public knowledge, so anyone could test or connect to these services on your MikroTik. So to try for example, for unauthorized access. So what the technician or the administrator can do is actually you will try to change the default ports to a different port. And for instance, okay, so Winbox, I don't like 8291, so I will change it to 8292. For my SSH, I would like to change it to 2222. And okay, so for www, I will change it to 8080, for instance. So after you change, so let's just see the effect first. Okay, so if we just example the Winbox now, so if we want add in a different port, so the Winbox assumes that it is still 8291. So let's click connect. So you will see now an error that it could not connect until you issue the correct port number or the port number that you have changed for Winbox. So let's click connect, and there you go. You now have a connection on port number 8292. But don't think that by changing the default port of the services into another port numbers, you are now secured from unauthorized access. So it becomes now a false sense of security that by a mere change of port, you are now secured. So the problem is, or the honest answer is, it does not give you some sort of security because there are tools that will actually check or query what are now the updated listening ports of your device. So this is for educational purposes only. So for instance, you have this software that will query or do a port scan to your targeted device. And for this instance, we put in the IP of our MikroTik. We will also edit the well-known TCP ports to 10,000 because we know that our MikroTik device has some ports that is 8,000 and above. So again, this is for educational purposes only, just to illustrate that if you change the ports, it does not provide a security that we are hoping for. So if I run this scan, and if we will wait for a while, so it does not take that long to scan or to query what are the listening ports of our MikroTik device. So it took only less than 2 minutes to scan or do a port scan on this particular IP, and it lists and even it determines the operating system. So router OS, MikroTik, and it lists all the ports from this range. What are the ports that this router or this device is listening into? And if we take a look closely on the ports that we have changed, for example, the SSH protocol, we changed it from 22, now it's quadruple 2, so it's listed here. We have changed our port 80, and it's listed here, 8080. And although it doesn't give a description for this particular port, now we have a clue that it is on 8292 instead of 8291. So now you see that changing of the ports or the default ports does not really help that much in terms of security because yes, although though there are some novice persons or users that won't be able to know that there are port scanners, but obviously port scanner software are freely available in the internet, and obviously many are also aware of those. So we will put back the default port and put back to their original port numbers, and let's think of other ways on how we can secure our IP services. One important thing to note is I purposely don't have any firewall filter rules. So most of the unauthorized access happen when we remove these default filter rules and don't put any to secure our network. Also, you notice that a firewall filter rule, and if you go add and go to the extra tab, you'll notice there is a setting for port scanner detection or PSD. So we can go ahead, create a PSD rule and try to block any port scanner on our network environment. Let's quickly add those PSD rules. So plus sign, input chain, protocol will be TCP. You could have also a different set for UDP. So we go to extra PSD. So we'll leave this setting by default, or you can go more strict. But for now, let's leave the setting by default action. We will add the source to address list for those who are our PSD or port scanners. So for example, port scanners, apply, okay. So for those doing some port scan will be added on our port scanners. And we'll now have a second rule. So input and any from our port scanners will be drop. Okay, so apply, okay. Let's try again our port scan. So the end objective is we won't be seeing the ports for our MikroTik router OS. So we have this port scan rules, and also there should be corresponding bytes and packets to be read, especially here in our drop. Okay, so let's do a scan and let's wait while this software commences doing a port scanning. And once it starts, it should increase the bytes and packets. It should display the address list of our port scanner. And finally, there should be bytes and packets on our drop rule. Okay, so there are some early results here. So HTTP and FTP. So no worries. So here, let's try see if there is no more services listed or ports listed here, and our port scanner rule in fact block this particular computer from continuing to do port scanning detection or port scanner detection. And you'll see this is the IP address of this computer. After we can block any port scanners, but if we leave our IP services to its default setting, we can still experience more attempts of unauthorized access. So if you check the logs and take a look at what is the entry of this log, so nothing much, all normal, but allow me to illustrate what is not normal, or at least a vivid evidence that somehow there are now attempts to your MikroTik device. So take a look closely on this, because in a while there will be a storm coming. Okay, all still normal. And now you see there are now several attempts. So via Telnet to your device and doing some funny logins or testing some well-known logins to your MikroTik device. So if you could see the logs, the attacks are via the Telnet protocol. So perhaps you go to your IP services and disable this one. And you won't be having any attacks for the moment on your telnet. So what if there is another attack to your SSH? So you will be also considering now changing or removing or disabling the SSH on your IP services. Now on the logs, you'll see that the attacks are coming from SSH or via SSH. So you could go to IP services and this time disable the SSH. And then after disabling the SSH IP service, you will be seeing another attack, or this time coming from FTP. So what I'm trying to illustrate from these scenarios is that these attacks are not just simple logins by a single person and not just by doing some port scan. So they have some specialized softwares to perform this unauthorized or attempt for unauthorized access. So what are the options or the things that we can do in order to mitigate those unauthorized access and ultimately safeguard our device? So first, we can go through the IP service list and disable the services that are unsecure and those that we don't use. So for instance, we will disable API, API SSL, FTP, and we'll left SSH and Winbox for our service. So for instance, SSH and Winbox is all left that is enabled in our IP service list. Next is if we check on the logs and go back to the attack logs, you'll notice that these attacks are coming from or the MikroTik list the source IP address for which the unauthorized attempt is coming from. So what you can do is perhaps you'll have the address list and create, for example, a block address list and put in the address that was the origin of the attack or the unauthorized access. Although you can do this step or process, this will not be ideal in the long run. Okay, so because the attacker could just simply use a different public IP or private IP and to circumvent this particular IP firewall filter rule once you create this and block this address list. What you can do instead is here in our IP service list, you'll notice the column available from. So meaning to say these services will be available from, so if we go inside, available from which particular IP. So for example, I want only the Winbox to be available from this IP. So type in the specific IP address and I will also do that on my SSH. Okay, so you could add additional IPs here. So for instance, this is when you are inside or in the internal network and there are cases that you are in the outside, or for instance, you are at your other branch company. So you might put in a trusted public IP. So you have to take note of your IP addresses and put it also here on the available from. So you have more options aside from only an internal network. Or you could stay put only with private IP addresses, so be it your internal network or your tunnel IPs. So you could create some tunnels here in order to connect to your MikroTik and have a private or a tunnel IP instead. So instead of putting a public IP for which in the future it may change, or for which you will be transferring to a different public IP, so we don't know, or you're transferring to a different telco. So might as well maintain it as a private IP or a tunnel IP for your available from settings. Another option is to implement what we call port knocking. So here you could see the link. So kindly visit MikroTik Wiki. So there is a sample set of commands or filter rules to configure port knocking in your MikroTik. Just please don't mind if these rules are currently disabled. So we will have a separate video about port knocking soon. But what it does is you have to know the sequence of ports in specific time in order to access your device. Hence the name port knocking. So as a summary, our MikroTik device has default services that are opened. Obviously, these services are there to accommodate different ways to manage our device. However, some are exploiting these open services for their malicious activities. So it is prudent for us to be aware of these activities, how we can mitigate or prevent this, and know what are the options in our disposal for which we can safeguard our device.